healthcare business podcast from the Coker Group that focuses on solutions to help healthcare organizations effectively navigate the changing healthcare industry landscape. Welcome back to another episode of Coffee with Coker. We're going to jump right into today's discussion, which before I do that, I want to introduce our guests. We have two members of the Coker team that have been on the podcast a number of times, but we have Brandt, Jewell, and Taylor Cowart. And what we are talking about, or what Brandt and Taylor are going to give us a little bit more information on today, is site neutrality. And this is a topic that we've actually covered, we've talked about going back to 2019, and we've talked about it a number of times, but just recently, here as we're recording this in August of 2020, just literally within the last couple of weeks at the end of July, there was an update from CMS on the new changes or some updates to the approach to this whole issue. And it's one that literally affects any group or hospital out there that does outpatient, that provides outpatient services, ancillaries, things like that. And it could entail very significant changes as far as billing and the value of those services. So we wanted to kind of follow back up on this. Just recently, Taylor had actually written up a kind of summary of what's happened, what the new changes are, what it means kind of going forward, looking ahead, and things to look out for. So we'll make sure there's a link to that in the description of this episode, but you can find that on Coker's website. But we wanted to talk about it a little bit more depth here, and as we kind of learn more, we'll continue to follow it. But I guess jumping right in, and Brandt, I may tee you up first on this, but just start and give us a little bit of background as far as what site neutral payments even means when we refer to that term.
Yeah, so hospitals have historically benefited from the Outpatient Prospective Payment System, OPPS, as a reimbursement mechanism for hospital outpatient department facility fees compared to their private practice peers who are under the Medicare Physician Fee Schedule. And so procedures that are performed in a freestanding clinic versus an HOPD received about 75% less reimbursement. And hospitals were therefore highly incentivized to acquire independent sites, switch the designation to HOPD, and begin increasing their reimbursement for the same procedures. This obviously results in HOPD billings effectively growing and essentially doubling over the last decade. And Medicare and its beneficiaries were under pressure to figure out some way to focus less on the site of delivery and more on the quality of care being delivered.
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of the transaction work that Coker has done, for instance, much of it is driven by the incentive here and the increased value that can be obtained through the HOPD strategy. So, Taylor, maybe jump in. I mean, what is CMS trying to do, or what are they doing now?
Yeah, Mark. So what basically happened was in 2015, there was the Bipartisan Budget Act, which was under President Obama's administration. And he came out, and this was really where all this started from. And he said that off-campus provider-based sites that began billing under the OPPS on or after November 2nd, 2015, would not be paid for services under the OPPS model after 2017. And then that kind of got revised as the years went on. They said, okay, you're accepted if you were on or before November 2nd, 2015. We're also going to accept you if you had plans in place. So that's a large number of facilities that still were able to bill under that OPPS. And it only affected those that had not yet begun billing under that model. And what that basically did was for those people, for those non-accepted hospital outpatient departments, they'd receive 40% of the OPPS rate. So again, that only affects those that came after that 2015 cutoff. And that also affects any of those that were technically accepted, but that relocated facilities or remodeled significantly or had a change in ownership. And then in 2019, they came out with an additional update to the OPPS that said, going forward, and this is where what we're talking about when we say the site neutral payments is really talking about. And they said that going forward, all G0463s, which is just the code for clinic visit services, clinic site visits, they would be reduced as in comparison to what the OPPS historically was. So just for reference, I mean, that code alone accounts for more than half of all codes billed at hospital outpatient departments in 2017. So that is extremely significant. And what that would look like is for example, in 2018, the average payment was about $116. In 2019, that was reduced at 30% to $81. And in 2022, a 60% reduction to $46. So again, we're talking about significant dollars here that would be phased in. And that's the big issue that we're facing today and the pushback from the hospital.
I mean, you're talking significant drops in value of the services, at least based on how they were previously billing. And, that's going to go direct to the bottom line for a lot of these organizations that previously operated heavily under these HOPD designations, I guess. So I'm curious, when you think about CMS here, any thoughts as far as what their kind of justification for doing this? I mean, you're talking 60% reduction in this one area over 3 years, 2 years, maybe. What was the biggest driving force, or how did they justify that?
A good question. There's been a lot of support. This is not a new conversation. We're seeing the fruits of that labor now, but the MedPAC, Medicare Payment Advisory Committee, as well as the American Medical Association, have both been long-term critics of the payment differences in OPPS. And CMS, I think, was increasingly concerned about the growth rate, which suggested the payment incentives more so than patient acuity or medical necessity, or what was driving the site of service. And so really contradictory to their entire philosophy around quality of care and where we're headed as a country with our healthcare system. So CMS projected that site neutral payments would reduce Medicare spending by over $300 million in 2019 for these routine visits. And additionally, Medicare beneficiaries would pay $7 less in co-payments for clinic visits at the off-campus provider-based departments. And really the underlying philosophy, I think, is that competition in healthcare should be based on the quality of care versus the location of care. And site neutral payments will give patients more options to make their own choices and decisions as it relates to their own personal care. And so I think it's more aligned with the direction CMS has been taking and the position they've been taking on a number of issues. And this one, I think, grew to a size and or an opportunity from a financial perspective that could no longer be ignored.
Yeah, it sounds like it's in line with the general gradual shift towards, reimbursement centered towards things that incentivize quality or that effectuate quality and pay for value themes, as opposed to the traditional pay for volume. And I guess also kind of a balance in the overall economic model for the actual patients. When you think about, this just the co-payment impact there, but that's going to trickle down to a lot of different things for private payers as well, commercial payers as well. But I guess one has to ask in this overall discussion, what about the hospitals?
Yeah, so Mark, it's not surprising. Hospitals, as you would imagine, were extremely upset by this decision and really felt that it was unfair given how much more regulations and compliance considerations and all the costs that go into running a hospital versus these private entities. So we saw big hospital groups like the American Hospital Association, the Association of American Medical Colleges, as well as a number of private groups that fought back against CMS, just basically saying that it's inherently more expensive to run these hospital outpatient departments and that these adjustments completely made sense. And the reason they were put in place way back when still stands today. And they are concerned that this will impact the quality of care and their ability to meet the at-need populations. And one of the things they say is, if you look at who's coming into the hospital versus going to some of these outpatient departments, it typically is some of the more risky or high acuity patients that are going to require more cost to treat inherently. So again, it's they argue that everything that goes into what the care they're providing and to be doing it at a high quality requires more cost. And so to them, this was just a complete blow and really concerns them that they won't be able to continue to give the same level of care that they have historically to their communities.
I definitely think there's validity there because they are different. They are different animals as far as running those different types of facilities and who's running them and how they're running them and who they're seeing and what services they're providing. So I can definitely see it's not just purely a negative financial impact, but there are, I think, maybe unintended consequences that the AHA and others are bringing up. I'm curious though. So you said they're kind of pushing back and fighting these. What have they been doing to do that?
Yeah, so in September 2019, those organizations filed an opinion to halt the policy, again, arguing everything that we've said. And actually, it was a U.S. District Judge, Rosemary Collier, was in complete agreement with them and ruled against the policy, stating that CMS could not reduce rates for hospital outpatient services in a non-budget neutral manner. And this kind of goes to what we'll talk about later, but that's the key is how is this done? And right now it would be this non-budget neutral. It would be obviously a net loss. So CMS agreed and said, okay, if that's the case, we'll repay 2019 reimbursements affected under that policy, but they still continue to drive forward with 2020 under the same policy. So, the ruling, and just as a quote, it said, the ruling affirmed that cuts directly undercut the clear intent of Congress to protect hospital outpatient departments because of the many real and crucial differences between them and other sites of care. So again, this case was in complete agreement. In 2019, when CMS said, fine, we accept what you said for 2019, but we're still going to charge ahead with the 2020 OPPS rule that was very similar, that same site neutral payment adjustment, those organizations again filed a suit saying, we just went through this argument. Why are we continuing to go down this path? And Judge Collier, who is the one that issued that initial judgment in 2019, filed her statement basically saying, I agree with you, but again, because this is a lawsuit and it's not something, this is looking at it prospectively versus retrospectively, there's nothing I can do at this point. So she said, basically, you'll have to get those reduced payments in 2020 and we'll have to go through this same process again, where you file a suit and I rule in your favor and then you get the repayment. But she did say, clearly CMS, she said it calls into serious question and appears to set the agency above the law. So basically just saying, they're not listening to what I'm saying. They continue to drive forward with their decision and clearly are not taking into account what we've said here. So, I just think it obviously speaks to CMS's commitment to continuing through with this site neutral payment adjustment.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because you'll remember the old sustainable growth rate where for years and years, each year, it was projected cuts that would have significant financial impact on providers and the value of services. So every year, Congress had to basically intervene for that year over and over again and put it into legislation and push it through the legislative process. And it was just kind of this roller coaster or even kind of hamster wheel type feeling for a number of years until they finally really changed the fundamental approach. I could see this being a similar thing where if we're going to have to go through this process every year, I guess the good thing for the hospital's side of this case is that 2019 precedent was set and the case, so to speak, literally and figuratively was made as far as why this doesn't make sense. But there's the judicial system fighting with the executive branch of the government that has kind of this hamster wheel effect as far as how they're dealing with it thus far. So I guess that kind of all brings us to, so that was all at the end of 2019. We're now over halfway through 2020, and what an interesting year it's been. But fast forwarding now to today, what's been the latest activity and the more recent developments?
So with the overturning of the reversing of the ruling, the Trump administration has maintained that CMS has the authority to impose payment cuts as a way to reduce unnecessary and costly increases in hospital procedures. And so from here, hospital groups continue to argue that CMS acted unlawfully and against the intent of Congress, and have asked the Federal Appeals Court to reconsider its ruling. So where we sit, it becomes very political, and given the election year, even more so. And so I think how that plays out will be a big part of what the end of this story looks like. This timing could not be worse for hospitals to be suffering as they are from COVID, and desperation for cash, revenues just dropping through the floor, and these budget cuts would further the negative impact in some of the most hard-hit organizations and communities that are already struggling to keep the doors open. So I think how the timing plays out between rebound from COVID, elections, and ultimately the final rulings and how this the funds are redistributed or achieved, I think that'll really be a make or break decision for a lot of organizations. And we've already seen a number of organizations trying to either prepare for this or going through exercises before these rulings and reversals that would help them identify their risks and weaknesses and things of that nature.
Yeah. So I think that kind of is an interesting segue, or brings us full circle. One of the things I like to do when we're having these conversations is, how are these things going on either in Washington or in the judicial system or somewhere in the country? Obviously, whatever happens, or maybe even doesn't happen, is going to have significant impacts on our clients, the hospitals, the health systems, even the groups out there, particularly groups that are part of a health system. So I'm curious, two things. Talk for a second about anything you all have observed as far as working with our clients on how they're responding to this, how they're maybe preparing for it, or, kind of trying to see around the bend a little bit. And then the second thing is, what are some recommendations we can give as far as steps that can be taken or actions that can be taken today, even in the midst of kind of this uncertain period?
Yeah, I'll start. I think one of the interesting things is how this affects hospitals' transactions with physicians. I mean, if we look at the rise in consolidation and the rampant employment of physicians across the nation, part of that, as we've discussed, was driven by the incentive of these hospital outpatient department billings. And so now as we look at it, the question becomes, are these still financially viable models if reimbursement is being reduced by 60%, and especially in certain specialties that is going to be extremely prevalent for. So we look at that, we look at what that means from a compensation of physicians as well. Is there compensation that they previously agreed upon? Is it still commercially reasonable? All of these things, one of the things we may see is, well, does it make sense now that we partner without employing? So will we see a rise in things like professional services agreements and these items that are still affiliations but aren't necessarily employment? Will we see an uptick in physicians that are disengaging from hospitals and realizing that now the economics aren't there that makes sense for them to be employed, and therefore maybe it makes more sense to return to private practice? And we've seen a couple of those in the last couple of years, and as this comes to light. So I think just as we consider all of these hospital physician transactions, obviously not all of them are completely based on this, but it definitely was considered when these initial pro formas were run and when they were trying to decide the profitability of these transactions.
Yeah, that's a good point, because as we know, the valuations behind the valuations that drive these transactions, where a hospital affiliates, purchases, acquires whatever with a group, is based on market value and fair market value. But market value is determined, or has been and currently is, until this permanently changes, determined by the model that we've been under with the HOPD rates. And so one might think that, oh, this is just here to benefit the hospitals, or the only risk is to the hospitals if this goes through. But it applies just as much, in my opinion, or very much so, to physicians as well, as far as the risk, because if and when they do choose to align with the hospital, they're probably going to stand under this newly proposed model to get much more discounted valuations, and kind of the value of them as an entity or an enterprise could go down significantly, because that value is tied to rates to a certain extent, or it's tied to market value, which inherently and intrinsically incorporates the current rates. So I think that's something to keep in mind, that this isn't a hospital versus doctor argument here, or conflict. This is something that impacts market value, and that can trickle down and have a number of kind of downstream impact areas that we may not even be aware of, or may not think as much about. So, Brandt, maybe kind of go into my second part of that question. Talk about some of the things that maybe our clients can be thinking about doing and preparing for now in the midst of all this.
Yeah, I think the acquisitions and affiliations and alignment will certainly be impacted, and agree with Taylor across the board. We've been working even before and throughout this process with clients that were already trying to decide if they convert HOPDs to ASCs, if they should be pursuing provider-based billing at one or all eligible sites, trying to figure out what we do with what we already have. So because of all the alignment activity we've seen over the recent years, there are a number of systems who don't get to make that choice on the front end and think about it as a potential impact, but more so they're going to be impacted and need to figure out to what extent and what that means for their strategy. Do they close down certain sites of service? Do they move away from HOPD back to a different environment for certain services? Do they start to funnel patients in a different direction? And so I think that there's a pressing problem that we've seen for our current clients about what do we do with what we have today and how at risk are we? So we've been doing some sensitivity analyses for clients to say, okay, if this fixed, how much of an impact could this have to your revenue, your bottom line, and then what would the other implications strategically and operationally be for you if these revenue drops stay? And so I think that's a healthy exercise, and not an overly time-intensive exercise to go through at a time like this, where you have a little bit of runway here to get prepared if you need to for the final ruling. But right now is a great time to be analyzing that, making sure you understand the potential impact, and then developing a contingency plan, or being proactive and saying, you know what, we see the writing on the wall here, and even if it doesn't get through this time, this is likely to not be a revenue stream or increase that we can enjoy for the long term. We need to go ahead and start making plans to shift away from that. I think many have, but this has not been able to be a front runner issue here over the last 6 months now, due to all the other craziness around volumes and reimbursement.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think the financial impact and understanding and planning for it is even more acute now, based on the already significant impacts that we've seen through 2020 thus far. So it'll be interesting, and we'll continue to track this. Obviously, we'll continue to provide updates as more information comes out, or if the new ruling is published. We'll also, again, as I mentioned earlier, we'll make sure we've covered this on a couple of different pieces and even discussed it in podcasts in the past. So it may provide a little bit more background. We'll make sure the links to all those are available in the show notes here. But other than that, this has been extremely helpful. We'll continue to stay tuned. So we'll look forward to hearing from Brandt and Taylor as more information emerges on this. But until then, thanks for contributing.
Thanks for having us.
We hope you enjoyed that episode of Coffee with Coker, and we thank you for listening. We want to encourage all of our listeners to participate and contribute in the podcast. So if you have any questions on any of the things we discussed in this episode, any of the topics that were presented, please feel free to ask us. Also, we welcome your feedback and suggestions. If you have any ideas related to the material we discussed in this episode, or in any episode, please let us know and we'll make sure to incorporate it. And if you have ideas for topics you'd like to hear more information about in future episodes, please send those suggestions to us. We would love to hear them and we'd love to incorporate them into our future episodes. You can find us online and on social media. Start with our website, and specifically the podcast is coffeewithcoker.com. You can also find that through the main Coker website at cokergroup.com. You can also find us on social media, Twitter at Coker Group, and then on LinkedIn, you can search for Coker Group and find our page and the page for some of our team members as well there. So you can find us and reach out to us in a number of places. And then if you want to contact us directly, one of the best ways to do that, email feedback@cokergroup.com. That's feedback@cokergroup.com. And again, we'd love to get your feedback, and we'd love to encourage everyone to subscribe to the podcast so that you can be notified when future episodes are released. We look forward to the next episode, and we look forward to getting your suggestions and feedback on this episode. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to speaking with you again on future episodes.